So you were in
Welcome to Freshers Credits. Woohoo! I'm Becca's chair of our committee, so I'm just going to welcome you and give you the rundown of how this works. So we start off with Becca's presentation, 20 to 30 minutes, and then the committee, which consists of Eileen and Will, will ask some questions. After we ask some questions, we'll open up to all of you. So if you want to take notes and just think about things that might clarify or that you're interested in, the idea is that it turns into a discussion. Okay. I'm so glad. I'm really impressed with this turnout.
Yeah.
It's important to the candidate and it's important to us too. Okay, Becca, you're on.
Okay, thanks for coming, guys. I'm just gonna jump in. So I made a PowerPoint. That's a good way to do things. So I'm going to introduce the project, talk about a lot of the stuff we did pretty briefly, and then talk about kind of what I learned during the process and then a little bit after as well. So that's kind of the stream of things. Okay, shift. Exploration of empathy. I'm going to start with talking about what the initial inspiration for the project was. I have like a lot of images. They're just really beautiful, and I was really struck by the pictures that were taken throughout, and I also wanted the dancers that did this project with me to be included in the defense as well. So, okay, my initial inspiration, it's kind of difficult to pinpoint exactly when this project started for me in this way, but I kind of try to narrow it down. The first thing is just my tendency to over-empathize and over-personify other things, and it was becoming a real problem. My poor husband, every show we watch, every movie, I said, can't watch this. So it like is alluding to some struggle of some other being, and I can't watch it. So it was kind of a thing. And then when I was experiencing this, I was looking around, wondering how other people coped with that same issue, and was realizing that it wasn't really as big of a problem for everybody else. And then I was just noticing the climate of discussion in our social world, our political world, and thinking that it was being done without much of an empathetic attempt at all. So I had my own ideas about why all these things were happening, but I couldn't answer them concretely enough for me to feel satisfied. And so that led into this investigation. So I narrowed it down to this research question of how can dance movement research contribute to developing strategies for fostering an empathetic environment. So this is in its broadest phase of research. It gets a lot more narrow as we go along, but it started here. Okay, when I created Shift, I went through these 4 general phases. The first, theoretical research, movement exploration, visual exploration, and then the presentation of the final project. So I'm going to talk through these as we go. The first one being theoretical research. This was one of my favorite phases. I loved this part. I got stuck in it probably for way too long because I was really digging it. Just kind of kept going. So I looked at a lot of different fields' view on empathy. It's scattered through a lot of different schools of thoughts because it's a really, it's kind of a big deal, and it touches on almost everything. I focused a lot in, of course, the dance realm, somatics, neuroscience, psychology, behavioral science, anything else I could really get my hands on. So the first question I was trying to answer is, what is empathy? The short answer is that it's basically just a way of understanding and sharing the feelings of another person. This answer ended up getting increasingly more complex as I went along. The first way being that empathy itself can be distributed between these 3 functions. So the first one affective empathy, that's the ability to sense another's emotions and respond to them. And then there's cognitive empathy, the ability to actually identify and understand the feelings of another person, and then compassionate empathy, which is the action in response to empathetic impulse. So these are further categorized by the path they take in the brain. Affective empathy they call top-down. It's from directly perceiving another person's emotional response. Cognitive empathy, they call it bottom-up. It's imagining another person's emotional situation. So for me, it was helpful to separate these in this way just to understand the different processes of empathy, but then to integrate them back into one large dynamic process. Okay, so then it was, why is empathy important? For me, it was really clear. I felt that empathy was important because it created a genuine connection with other people. I felt other people's lives, people, species, everything else is valuable. And it should be valuable to me at all times as well. But not everybody has the same perspective on why empathy is important. So I then dove in to try to find something that I could say, this is why you should think it's important. And at its most basic level, I found that it's just evolutionarily supported for our species' survival, empathy itself, from the very beginnings. So in any species whose young requires long-term care after they're born, it's crucial for the survival of the species, so they actually take care of their babies. So parents are integrated with empathetic responses so that they can respond to the needs of their young. And then those empathetic impulses are maintained throughout life and remain dependent through all of our interpersonal reactions and are reliant on group dynamics. Like we're a pack species. So these things are still important even past postnatal care. There's also a lot of what I was reading. These researchers were pointing out these specific attributes that suggest that this is like a clue to why it's so important. And one of those is distress vocalizations. So the fact that we and other mammalian species, specifically and birds and all these other, we cry out when we're in distress, and then other people are called to help. So that's kind of a clue. Okay, the next question is, how does it work? So that's what it is, that's why it's important. So then how does it work? Two things I came to really understand through this project. One is that empathy is super necessary, and the second is that it's in constant flux. So I looked into the neurological process of empathy to kind of understand it on a microscopic level, and this was the one thing I didn't have any natural understanding of when starting this process. So it took a lot of process to understand it. So I looked at the neurological process of empathy and I related it to the theory of embodied cognition, which is basically stating that the mind works in conjunction with the body and that they're one thing, which has answers. We understand a lot, we study pretty specifically, especially in the somatic realm. But these things are one dynamic thing making the decisions for us. It's not just the brain telling the body what to do, or vice versa. Okay. So one of the ways in which I came to understand the neurological process of empathy was through looking at research being done with MRI scans, watching the neural pathways of empathy. And a lot is understood about this by looking at how it does not function in people. So this is my next one. Okay. So empathy can be enhanced and diminished at any time, and it is in a constant state of being either enhanced or diminished. I was looking through these studies done when people go in, they were going through the prison system, and they were doing MRI scans of people that have been categorized as psychopaths, which is the term for anybody with non-functioning empathy at a neurological level. So they were running them through these exercises, they'd hook them up, they'd scan them, and they'd ask them to imagine themselves in pain and imagine somebody else's pain, and they'd have all these other prompts with it. And when the psychopath would imagine other people in pain, the neurological pathways of empathy did not light up. But when they imagined themselves in pain, those pathways would light up. Another big difference was that when imagining other people in pain for some on the extreme level, the brain would also light up in the pleasure area. So it would be non-empathy and then also a little bit of a pleasure response. So there's just a lot going on there. And what that kind of suggests, the researchers that I was reading were saying that these pathways can be used, I think it's the memo, it's the last one I just wrote down. Therapeutic approaches can be used to help these people pair the ability they have to experience empathy for themselves and then connect it to empathy for other people by enhancing those neurological pathways in the correct way. So it's always in a state of flux, but we actually have some control about how it's built in the brain. And the reason that these things are so flexible is this idea of neuroplasticity. So the brain, just like anything else in the nervous system, is an organ, and it's constantly repatterning based on our experiences, and it's totally ready to get work on. Yeah. Okay, so I kind of touched on this for a second earlier, but I took a somatic approach to both the theoretical research as well as the movement research. So when doing the theoretical research, even though I was looking at everything all separated out in these different schools of thoughts and these different contexts, I was trying to integrate it all and then bring it to the movement research. And then in the movement research, I felt like it was important for the dancers to be able to access the information through their own approaches, through their own life experiences, and to be able to experience them through the whole soma and then contribute to the movement transition from there. Okay, so I had done everything I needed to do by myself. I looked at everything and I was ready to make a plan. So the first thing I did was narrow my focus and create these exercises to bring to the answers. So I narrowed the focus into how empathy relates to building relationships, the impacts of the absence of empathy, the wider moral context of empathy, and then how the knowledge of the neurological process can help the contextualization of the movement research of empathy. Then I made these exercises. So these are empathy building exercises that I've termed for this process and for my document, all this stuff, as cognitive somatic empathy enhancing exercises, or CCs, because that's like a really big mouthful every time. And every time the document, I was like, come on. So CCs. So at the basic level, they're exercises created to enhance the empathetic atmosphere for the dancers. Specifically, at this point, I was thinking specifically about the dancers when we came together and how we would move forward in our own project. When I designed them, I tried to base them off of what I had learned, how empathy works in the brain and in the body, and through the emotional system. And so I used visual, auditory, verbal, tactile, memory recall, and reflective experiences. The purpose was to encourage individual empathy by affecting the related neurological pathways, just like that research had suggested. And this would be through somatic action and experiences with each other. Hi, Diana! So then I brought all this stuff. Diana, get some snacks. I brought all this to the dancer, and it was time to get moving. Time to enter the movement exploration phase. This was actually an image from our very first rehearsal. Yeah. Okay, so there was this section that I had planned for the ending performance piece that would display the whole idea of realizing empathy in the first place, creating that empathetic connection. And I used Mr. Slim Lim's idea here to fuel this creative process. And it was the process it takes to empathize with another person mirrors the creative process. So he was suggesting that the process of creating new meaning out of somebody else's experiences and feelings is similar to creating new meaning out of movement. or whatever creative process you employ. So when we first met, we went through a bunch of these exercises, and at the same time, we're generating movement and other things for the dancers I want to get into, so we're here all day. It's like a lot of stuff. We did for like a lot of months. So the idea was that we were generating the movement from the process of realizing empathy in the moment instead of reflecting on it later on and creating from that. Okay, beyond that, there were two improvisational frameworks that maintained their form for the final performance of Shift, Worms and the gesture conversation. I'll tell you what that means. So the first one was this. I wanted to explore those very first moments when you enter the world and you immediately start blindly seeking out connection just because you have those impulses. And it kind of was seeming to me similar to the experiences of worms. So I studied worms for a while. It was a really fun day. I was sitting at the desk like, Sherry, did you know this about worms? And she's like, no, I didn't. And then I brought that information back to the dancers, and we talked about all of these attributes of worms so that we could understand their intentions, and then we embodied them. It was fun. Some of the facts that really stuck out for me, not even looking at this. Ooh. Nobody mind the spaz clicking. Okay, so I have no idea where it is, but I think I can remember it. Worms have no ears or eyes that are actually formed. They breathe through their skin. They also sense touch through these bristles that they have all over their body, and that's also how they move forward in the dirt. All worms are both male and female. They carry both reproductive organs, and so their roles are just determined when they meet each other and whatever works best for them. And they move backward and forward equal ease. I think
Light sensitivity.
Yeah, they're slightly more light sensitive on one side, which is, yeah, they don't have like a head, but they're just slightly more sensitive to light, so they can kind of tell like maybe that's their top part. Okay, so we used those concepts, and over again, the dancers would start on the very edges of our rehearsal space, and they would have to make this really long durational journey to the center, to the other bodies, and they weren't really using their limbs at all, just like their center body, like a worm. And then their focus was down on the floor, so once they did meet each other, they relied on the sensorial experience of each other to create the physical connections, rather than like look, decide, move. So that ended up being the introduction to the concert piece as well. And I did. Yeah. Okay. So the second framework was titled The Gesture Conversation. So this was an exploration of more complex interpersonal relationships through communication. The initial parameter was just to non-verbally communicate with each other through specific gestures and use dynamic emphasis of like structured sentence, grammar, commas, exclamation points, question marks, that sort of thing. It was a semi-familiar experience for everybody to jump into, and then we built the complexity of the parameters as we went. So it developed into, we also ended up, we first started with just random gestures, and then through the CCs and other interactions, we created meaningful gestures from group discussions on empathy and those empathetic experiences. And then they had a gesture bank of 80 gestures that they communicated with. So they're just running around talking to each other with their gestures. And then if you are physically touched by another person, you have to freeze in whatever shape you were last communicating in, and you have to wait there for another person to come pick you up, move you to a different spot on the stage where you can continue communication from there. Everybody shared those roles, so everybody had to constantly be on the lookout for people that had been frozen in communication, while also having in communication, while also not smacking each other also probably doing like a lot of stuff. And then it ended up being we designated Felix and Carrion. They were the mega pickers. They would pick people up, and their role was to bring them to this downstage part of the stage. And once they put you there, you had to remain there and continue communicating to the abyss in front of you instead of the rest of the people behind you. So that ended up being the final structure. All right. At this point, we had this whole beginning structure set. Everybody was there. With summer rehearsals, it was a lot of like really small, like 3 people there to 7 to 8 people there out of the group of 11. At this point, everyone's there. The whole structure was set all the way through the worms, the C-generated movement, and then this gesture conversation. And then I was stuck. I was like choreographically like, no, this is not, I don't know. I had no idea where to go from there. My original plan didn't feel right anymore. Those 4 things I originally wanted to focus on just wasn't really making sense. And so we just ran the piece again, from the beginning to the end, which is something we hadn't really done because it was so long. And especially those improvisational stuff that ended up being, for time's sake, just a little bit faster. So the first time we ran the piece from the beginning to the very end of the gesture conversation, there was a shift. So we had this group discussion after that run through, and this feeling was brought up of vulnerability when put in that downstage line, which was unexpected. That was just meant to transition into this other thing, but something about creating those connections with everybody through that long period of time physically, and then having direct communication, and then almost being put somewhere else and told like, okay, like you're not in this anymore. It just felt weirdly vulnerable. And this sent me down another awesome rabbit hole of researching in my computer. So I tried to find out what the role of vulnerability was in empathy. Why did this happen? What does it mean, basically? And then I ran across this woman, Brene Brown, who's an expert in vulnerability and empathy and also shame, which didn't really come into play in this, but she has some really good stuff in that maybe later. Then I brought this all back to the group when we had a group discussion about our own experiences with vulnerability and how that relates to what Brene Brown was sharing. And when we had that discussion, I brought in all this colored tissue paper and let everybody play with the tissue paper. Both as a way to like have this kind of comfort action when sharing this kind of sensitive information, and then also I liked the metaphor of the delicate tissue paper, and then they made this really cool stuff. That's Max, cool bird. So then from there, we created these 3 vulnerability groups. So each group had this common response to vulnerability that impedes empathetic action, and they were able to delve in the movement research with those specifically. So the first one was the catatonic response to vulnerability. This kind of brings me back, and when I was creating this slide, actually, this was the first time I made this connection. It's like, oh, that's what I was talking about in slide number 2. That's what that was. This is what I was experiencing at the beginning, this whole trying to avoid and trying to ignore these uncomfortable feelings because I didn't like them. So these quotes are from Brene Brown, and each group had a quote that they were building off of. Our capacity for wholeheartedness can never be greater than our willingness to be brokenhearted. So this also related to that whole neuroplasticity of the neurological system as well. Once those pathways are set in place to disconnect and to ignore, they can't just be switched on and off at a whim. They're there, and you have to work on re-accessing the actual empathetic pathways. So in entering this catatonic response, you are also cutting off a lot of other empathetic connections that you could have that would be really helpful for your well-being. Then we go into the second group, which looked at the dichotomous relationship between sympathy and empathy. So sympathy gets in the way of empathy. It's also how we respond when we don't want to be vulnerable to someone else's struggle. Empathy fuels connection, sympathy drives disconnection. So while sympathy can feel like a totally valid way to connect with somebody else's pain, because it does not require the action of actually being vulnerable, it still keeps this distance between you and that other person. And because it's masquerading as this connective process, people will rely on it really quickly. I do all the time. Oh, that sucks. Yeah, but unless you're actually envisioning what that other person is experiencing and allowing yourself to feel that vulnerable it won't be a true connection. And then the third and last group was reacting to vulnerability with blame. This one was a surprise for me. I could have maybe guessed the other ones if I really tried to. This one, never. Blame is simply the discharging of discomfort and pain. It has an inverse relationship with accountability. Accountability, by definition, is a vulnerable process. So I had been categorizing blame as a justified reaction to people that didn't, I wouldn't have said it in these words exactly, but almost didn't deserve my true empathetic. It's a lot of work sometimes to empathize with these other people, and if I feel like they're to blame and they're making some purposeful choice, I was able to cut off that reaction. This one's troubling because blame is really corrosive. Renee talks about how its corrosive nature creates this whirlwind of negative energy between two. It not only keeps the disconnect, but it goes further and further. Yeah. So the idea of vulnerability and empathy, its main role in summary is just that in order to actually empathize with somebody else in their situation, you have to reach within yourself and find whatever similarity you can in your own experiences and connect to that other person in that way. It has to be through your own self. It can't just be through an imagining of some otherworldly experience that some other mechanism or body is experiencing. Okay, that was the end of the movement exploration. And then I had the whole choreographic issue of how do you end this thing? Yeah, which I did weirdly. We did the three groups. These groups were the first time I had choreographically split up the dancers to explore different things separately. We'd all done everything together up until this point. And so I assumed that we would need to come together again at the end to conclude the piece. And so I choreographed this whole weird thing. And then the first time we ran it through, again from beginning to end, it actually felt concluded about 2 minutes before it was concluded. I was talking to my committee, it was that last showing, and it was wow, that was weird to keep going. So we just cut it off and ended exactly where it felt like it should end, and actually didn't have to design anything more than just a focus shift at the end. Ended up being really nice. So the movement section of it ended whole and connected in a way I didn't expect, because spatially, this is actually pretty much the exact last moment. It just moved it down a little bit. Spatially, we were not connected, but because in each of these groups, all the dancers stayed on stage and actively observed the experiences of the other groups, it was just as connective. And it was that whole empathetic connection of actually observing and being vulnerable and watching, and then that was that. Okay, the last little, this is kind of a weird little nugget I never know where to put things. I went into the experience of the neurological process of memory in a different way. It felt really incorporeal and abstract, compared to the physical and emotional response to vulnerability, so I wanted to portray it in that same kind of distantly abstracted way. So I wanted to make a dance film. And these were the three concepts that were built around: the neural pathways empathy takes in the brain, this idea of mirror neurons and how those affect relationships and connection, and then the neuroplasticity of the brain. It was this was one of the most challenging parts of the whole thing, just because all of it actually. Building the set for this was the worst. It was crazy. Finding the right room, I wanted it to be all black so that it could be circular and there wasn't some square front. I wanted it to be unrecognizable to the audience. And I wanted it to represent all of these videos and images that I had been watching when trying to understand the neurological process. So I wanted it to look like the bodies were in the brain in some kind of a way. So as you can see over here, I have a pointer, guys. Over here. That's Sharon, that's Alan, Amesy. We hung, and if you can see up there, the ceiling is not made for things to be hung in between things. I had rope, and I was sewing tulle over at my apartment, and Alan was like trying to organize the tulle in our little apartment. It was like 500 yards. We had no apartment. And then we brought it here, and we hung it up, and then we hung the string lights on top of it, and then we had these other lights on the bottom that were showing this. If you can see all those colored lights on the bottom. And it was like how to find something that could accommodate this type of a structure, had the right lighting so that you saw the structure as well as the bodies, but it wasn't overcoming the string lights. I'm glad it's over, but it was successful, so I feel good about it. And then the dancers in the set, the timeline of Gray Matter, that's the title of the video, took the same timeline that the bodies took in the concert piece shift. So the idea was that that was the physical representation, and then the film was the neurological representation on top of that. Then I tried it with the piece, front to bottom, or beginning to end, that's the words. And it was all wrong. It was originally meant to be projected on top of the stage on the back while the bodies were moving into space. And the first time seeing it with the bodies, it just really took away from the physical exploration that we had set up. It had this weird, like, this is pretty, even though we spent all this time researching and discovering that it's not such a pretty process. So, like 2 weeks before the show, it was like, okay, let's make an installation. Let's do this whole other thing. So then it became, I have access, let's carry on a bit. This installation version of it. So then the tool was hung up in these 4 panels with this plastic underneath. I put some filters on top of the footage to abstract it even further and give even more dimension to the color and the layers of the footage. And then they just played in loops the entire timeline with different filters that people could walk through, and it was showing through. So I just thought this was a way to respect what was happening on stage with the physical bodies and a way to respect the film itself. And they could both of it in, so then people had kind of a foreshadowing of what was about to take place on stage by looking at the installation. Okay. Presentation, my intention for the audience, I just wanted them to have a general idea. Leave the presentation with a feeling of the importance of empathetic impulse. The movement was pretty abstracted. There was never explicitly said anything about empathy in the title or the program. I, as an artistic choice, like abstraction better, and I also find it can provide more access routes for people because they can put their experiences on top of the performance. And then I was just hoping that they could genuinely connect to the dancers, and the idea being that since we really tried to access this empathetic research through our own lived experiences and then edit it to represent that's the best we can do. I hope that it came through in some way. Feedback from the audience was varied, but you generally had the tone of like, I felt like there was a connection. A lot of people even got empathy from it, actually. But just connection itself is good for me. They're like, I don't know, I felt something, it was nice, okay. Maybe later when that feeling resurfaces, it'll kind of call back to that. Biggest challenges, spatially organizing 10 dancers on stage for 35 minutes. Was crazy. I wanted everybody to experience the entire thing, the physicality of it every time, all the way through. So nobody ever left the stage. except Casey when her hair fell out. And then, just for a second. And then I also had really relied on movement cues over sound cues. In fact, the music was kind of just laid up over on top for a lot of it. And so having movement cues for 10 people on stage for 35 minutes, it required a lot of the dancers. They had to be super kinesthetically aware of the entire group the whole time while maintaining their own presence in the piece. Since we did so many exercises around this idea, I think that's what helped this become a possibility. It was not just like, try it. It's like we had done a lot of group work to develop that. Editing. Yeah, I struggled with the editing. I had reservations about editing the movement that was contributed by the dancers because it was coming from this place that I was asking them to access like their real life experiences in relation to this material, and then they give it to me, and I was like, oh, I'd be like, no. But now, reflecting back, I would have done that more just because I realized that it's just another way it's kind of representative of shaping the group mind, shaping the piece, is that everybody contributes. And then you edit it so that it works best as an entire group and as a full final structure. This challenged presence in the piece. So I was in the dance, and it was really hard the entire time to stop being the director, even while doing it. And then Mary was, I had a stress rehearsal, Mary was like, okay, it's okay, just let go, it's okay. And then for the concert, I was finally able to like not try to problem solve the entire time. Anybody was out of space, it was like, how can I fix that problem? Hey, you can fix it. They were actually extremely responsible dancers. So. And then the concept of communication, I've just been realizing that even though I tend to generate from this concept-driven place, I like to rip things apart and tear them down to their bones just so I can understand them. And a lot of times when I'm communicating those concepts, I forget that whole first part, and I just go from this analytic point. And so I kept having to remind myself after a while, like if you just give them the descriptive terms from the concept, a lot of times it'll happen in the body because it's natural, and that's the more organic way to reach that place. Still working on that. And then I developed myself. This was a challenge implementing all those voices into a collaboratively communicated project at the end. I learned to trust my artistic voice a little bit more, which is always a thing. My priorities as a choreographer, the relationships between the dancers, the organic construction, and then just pure physicality. And I understand empathy a lot more. It's really helping. And then the last place in which I developed, I feel like this one is a big one, is that for the first time entering a performance, I was not like sick with nervousness. That's just like a thing that I always have. And then before we started, I was like, guys, I feel great. And at the time, I thought it was just because I was too overwhelmed to be nervous, too distracted. But now, reflecting back, I realized that it was just because my definition of success had changed. And before the performance began, I already felt like it was successful. Because we created this group dynamic, we answered these questions, and everybody seemed happy, so success. Yeah. And the conclusion, the meaning of the title shift came from the shift in perspective needed to co-create empathy with somebody else, and also the unexpected shift that the piece took with the introduction of vulnerability. Another input from Brene, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection. So this idea, okay, now I have this information, how is this shared? How is this passed forward? The best way is to just continually attempt to connect empathetically with other people, and that connection leads to more connection. And I think there's something to being open about how it works and sharing that knowledge and just remembering it for yourself. And I've caught myself quite a few times like, oh man, I just did that whole sympathy thing, and then I'll switch it, and then it gets easier and easier as those pathways in the brain are emphasized. Okay. The definition of plasticity is the possession of a structure weak enough to yield to an influence, but strong enough not to yield all at once. This just kind of helps me remember that we all possess this structure that's strong enough to be able to withstand the social interactions that can seem negative while continually trying to connect. Trying to connect with someone is not going to break you down. It's just going to chip away a little bit, but it's going to continue to build yourself stronger. Oh, to be continued. I'm not done. I don't feel done. I'm done for now. I'm done enough for like document defense status. But even as I was making this defense and writing this document, oh my gosh, my timer was so long. There were all these things I kept getting caught up in. The two first questions are things that at the beginning I had wanted to respond to, but ended up discarding so that we could take on what was relevant at the time. And then this last one, empathy in the scientific method, I've just been coming across the entire research process, and it just seemed too big of an idea to even hint at including at this point in time. But even when creating this defense, I got caught up reading this article on mole constellation behavior, and I was like, oh, they're talking to each other, and this is how. And it brought this concept up again, and this kind of callous irony of researching empathy through scientific methods that involve the pain response. So that's kind of where I would head next. I think this is it. I think it is. It's it.
Thank you. Very, very thorough and detailed presentation. And I was also impressed by that kind of detail in your document itself, and how much research you put into this. It's just really phenomenal. Yeah, so I wanted to commend you for that. I want to go back to editing.
Yeah.
And about editing, that's kind of my first question for you. You said in the document that you were worried about editing people's material out, and that if you had to do it again, you would change your approach, but you didn't really elaborate on how you might do that. So I'm curious about that. How do you think you could change that? Maybe what would make you feel better about doing that? And do you think the fact that you didn't do that affected the choreographic outcome? How did it shape that?
I think that it shapes the end outcome. I kind of really busy for a lot of it. And I tried to organize it in a way that was digestible for the audience, but if I had entered that editing process a little bit earlier, I think that would have resolved some of the spatial organization as well. I've also been thinking about how starting the editing more at the beginning would have allowed those little movement nuggets that were really impactful. Those could have been brought in, those could have been expanded. But because there was so much material, there was no time in the piece part. We've already spent 20 minutes here, we got to move on. Even though I can almost feel myself being done to certain parts that I would have liked to expand on movement-wise.
You ignored those instincts to honor the
Yeah. Which they would have been fine, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
That was me probably being a little too sensitive.
Yeah, it seemed on some level, and I think this happens to a lot of people. You were so married to the material, to the content, that then it became hard to make artistic choices that serve the piece. Right? I think we all struggle with that. Like, we're so involved with the concept, and we love the concept so much that then it's hard to remove yourself enough to see the work.
Yeah.
And what does the work mean?
And by that time, I get really connected to it, and it's hard for me to put it out for myself too. I'm realizing that because I've been working on that this semester, and I came across a similar issue. It's like I feel like this should come out. I feel connected to it, and I had to really remind myself that it's like, but as a piece in the whole, it would be much better without it.
It's like defining the boundaries.
Yeah.
Defining the boundaries where where it cuts off and where it goes over here.
Exactly.
And that middle get another piece, or but that's interesting what you just said. You get really connected to it. You're empathetic. You get really connected to the material.
Like the movement, I'll get sad.
Yeah, and things precious to us.
The more it's there. So if I do that earlier on, then maybe I wouldn't get so connected. Or we spent all day working on it, or we just worked on it for 30 minutes and I've already entered this editing process. It's easier. I think.
Thank you.
It does make me think about it, just, I guess, kind of riffing off of Mary's question about editing, but I think you noted 2 or even 3 points where you backed up and you were stuck. And then you ran the whole thing from the beginning and let it take its time. And then something was revealed. I mean, through what you had cultivated with the dancers, going a kind of empathetic space, that kind of thing. So also the other impression I got, there's something about taking time anyways, luxuriating in that or exhausting something so that something can be revealed. So I think that also has to do with editing actually, so that you can see how you've got, what is speaking, and then in context, I think you just said it a few minutes ago, that it wasn't in parts anymore, but the whole started to speak. And I don't know, I just really appreciate that. I do think that it's tricky about limits in the context that you're presenting something that actually your work probably needs a couple hours, something like that. There's something durational in it, and certainly it takes time to repattern if you have to think about the concept itself. There's something about change over time, and then change in the physicality and the sensibility of the dancers in the group. That would have been really interesting to experience. When the NEA funds you with loads of money, and you got lots of no, but there's something about time, I think, that I would also have appreciated being in as an audience to just witness that and then to experience it myself. That invitation. I don't know what I'm getting at. But it has to do with editing, and the editing isn't necessarily getting in there and chop, but it's actually listening to the work and listening to yourself and those little whispers about all of this stuff.
Yeah. So we're not being patient about listening process and not just no time for that right now.
Yeah. That is so hard in this
Honoring, because I think you have it. You're trusting it too, maybe.
Yeah.
And that's what, have you heard of Elaine Aaron, highly sensitive people?
Yes.
That 12% of the population, which I guess as you fall in. And not to, I think it's, I also think I fall in that realm, are really important to the culture because they're the ones, when we were tribal, they were the ones that would have empathy with everything around them and know when something was off or know when something was on. And that they would kind of be tribe alarm system. So I would encourage you not to judge that, but allow that some space because I think that can unfold. But I was, I'm not a dancer, so I was more audience watching. The piece was like a dream, right? Because there was no words, it was more movement. And for the audience, I'm wondering, because of the abstraction, if it would have helped to help give them a bit of a language in which to approach it.
I wondered that same thing. I've been wondering about because there was also no sectioning out. It just started and then went and then ended eventually. So if sort of program or in a more descriptive title, I don't know the answer. I've been wondering about that because I tend away from explicit, especially in language. But I think that's also another way of that's another vulnerability thing. Like, okay, I'm telling you what I want you to hear. So now, if you're not hearing it, what does that mean about what I'm doing?
Yeah.
But really, it's still fine if they don't make that same connection, even if I'm trying to be explicit about something.
Yeah. it's like priming them for the experience and then seeing what that does to their own personal memory and ability to have empathy. Because to me, if the audience's interaction with it would depend on their ability to have empathy, then it would be an interesting thing to type back to the audience for their own world.
Right. I wish I could have like stopped everything. What do you think?
Yeah.
What do you feel?
Yeah. Especially because I found through working with the dancers, I think I had assumed that more people were walking around with like just empathy coming out of their pores, and really it's a difficult process to experience, and so to assume that anybody's walking around with that is kind of, now I'm like, I don't know what's going on with people. Yeah.
Well, the other, I always like when I'm on a thesis and then I get interested in something because of the thesis. So I've been looking at empathy and evolution. And, there was just an article on Monday on eyebrows and the evolution of the eyebrow as really the reason the eyebrow, why we have such a large the woman's name is Pempkin. Yeah, so
I came across we have such distinct between the whites of our eyes and the pupil and the iris is so that people can see where we're looking, and that's another way of connecting.
Yeah.
Like, well, what are you looking at? Versus if we had all dark eyes like reptilian, it would be a lot harder to make that connection.
Yeah.
And the eyebrows, I don't even know about the eyebrows.
Yeah, I didn't either until I read the article on Monday.
It's you.
Yeah, send it to me.
Well, it's about gray matter, so it's about the video, and I was just thinking also about what was just said about maybe for the audience and you cultivate experience empathy for them, possibly. A setup for gray matter. I was just wondering, and it's nice that you're here too. Mostly I noticed that, and for myself as well, that it was a visual experience, even though it was set up for people to be able to walk through. And I wondered what it would be, I don't know, just to think about that or reconsider it, or if you want to do anything else with it in terms of how you might invite sensory experience from the audience in the installation. Something as an individual or something as a group that might encourage already before coming in to see the performance a sense of connection to self or connection to other in the environment. So something sensory more than not just visual.
It'd be really interesting because the one thing that I felt kind of unsettled about that was the complete separation. Even though when I'm researching it, I was like, how to integrate all of it. And then in order to look at it visually, I took it away entirely. So it would be really interesting to see how to reframe that approach in some way. For it would be nice if somehow to be projected on the bodies as we're working through as well. If it went through the tool, through the body somehow.
And if audience had that experience, something like that could be just as confusing and abstract as not having words to explain it, but you have this weird experience going in. Yeah, I don't know, it's like walking through light, walking through cool, something, your own skin gets temperature in the room, I don't know, something like that. So I was just kind of riffing on that, and I realized it's once again a matter of time. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And a matter of the context that we're in.
But since I'm not done, it doesn't.
No, you've got beautiful material.
There's always time now.
And I just did a response to some of the images that you showed with the setting up. Actually, that looked like what might be going on in our brains, you know? That looked, the construction of things, this dark space going on. I don't know, or your partner disappeared in the tool. I mean, these stories help me think about like how my own brain might work, like how sensitive it might be to something or overloaded, or that connection to others, making something. I don't know. It's just kind of tripping on that. You know, there's something about its construction rather than its beauty. Let's say, if I can put it that way. Following along the lines of neurological pathways.
And there's something about how in that image it was really tall, but that was everything was on this floor level, and if there's a way to move through it more.
Yeah, vertically.
Yeah.
Possibly.
On the reverse image of it, looked like DNA.
Yeah.
Straight into DNA.
Yeah, all the tool and the lights, it was just like, throw it on there, okay, it's on there.
Yeah.
But to take a more purposeful design approach to the relationship of the materials to the materials would be really cool.
I think it was purposeful. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I just think you've got something there that's actually quite raw that would also serve the idea. Sorry,
You generated so much in this project, and so I don't think it's done. Like, I wouldn't throw anything away.
Does that mean I have to give you your tool back?
Plus all the extra tool you had to buy, it's all.
I also wanted to ask you a little more about your CCs.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Because the way you use them in the creative process and the steps you went through is really fascinating. And the way you talk about it in the document. So I was just wondering if you've thought about how you could apply them in different contexts, with different communities, mental health, well-being. Have you considered that?
Yeah, I would love to do that, especially when reading about the impact of the non-functioning empathy on all these people that are being imprisoned for things that could be totally reversed in a lot of those cases through therapeutic processes. And I mean, obviously being a believer of movement, being a part of that, it would be really cool to continue those. I need to write them all out in a better place because they're just in my rehearsal notes on their phone. But I think I would like to continue on with those. I think those were the kind of developed. I had originally in my undergrad wanted to go into dance therapy, and so I think it's all kind of
Definitely. But the way you wrote them out in the document, it was very clear.
Yeah.
There was a very clear logic to it. So I would hold on to those, and maybe it's a great opportunity to collaborate with someone else from social services.
Or even in design, because the design thinking module is empathy is the first module. And that notion of bringing those, as soon as I read them and I found them, you showed it, of getting that into design through movement, and getting them out of their freaking heads and get them into a somatic understanding of it versus this conceptual.
Yeah. The access when it's just like this.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what I like about him too, is because I'm kind of analytically minded about that stuff too, and it's hard for me to grasp things when they're just out in the world. That would be super.
Yeah, harvest.
Good to mention your lifelong project.
Yeah. I'll check back in 30 years when I may be done.
So much.
Graduate school paid off.
It's a beautiful document. It's such a pleasure. to
Yeah, it
read.
was. It really was well done.
Yeah, and gorgeous.
Yeah.
I had another question though. I'm just curious, did you talk much with the dancers about afterwards, post-performance, about their experience with the shift towards vulnerability, and then how that impacted the way they reached an empathetic state? Did you ever have conversations about it?
I don't think after the performance ended, I don't think we had a lot of conversation, which is something I think would have been nice. We talked a lot, as it was happening, we talked a lot about it. But I think it would have been helpful for me to take that same approach with doing the piece, doing the piece from the beginning to the end, after the entire ending, then talking with the dancers. If they still remember, I can ask them.
you might follow up with.
Yeah.
There's a whole dissertation,
Yeah.
like just in terms of
Yeah, and like-
having people explore empathy as a dancer and then what effect it has on them. And being able to capture that, I think, would just add to how you take it out into the world.
Yeah, it was funny because I kept having this kind of struggle with myself, especially when writing the document, having to really down what I'm saying. And I was like, do I have any claim to affecting anybody individually? I think I can claim the atmosphere a little bit and I can claim all these things, but without talking to people about what they feel. I feel like I couldn't claim that, but there is a way to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you didn't approach it as a study.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wish I
Yeah.
had a bit,
Yeah.
but next time,
But it
yeah.
was a lot of, it was a lot to take on. I'm just really curious, even informal conversations. what they thought. And maybe it is the next phase kind of thing.
You always hope that somebody's thesis or dissertation is kind of their step into their work. It's not it's the beginning of it, and that not to just end it there, but to keep exploring it.
Yeah, that's definitely gonna happen.
And keep exploring in relationship to your artistic process and your artistic goals.
Yeah. I think it'd be interesting to reach out, partner with different, because I looked at so many different schools of thought to create it in the first place. So to actually partner and communicate more with the people working in that field and then continuing the artistic side of it, would be really nice.
Yeah.
Just do it forever.
Okay. Do the committee, do we have any more questions? Thank you guys. Should we-
Okay, we're opening the floor. Any questions from the audience?
Comments, like kind of based off of what Mary was asking you about questions. I was in Mecca's case.
Yay, Haley!
I was there for a lot of this, so it's really fun to hear that. But I would say, thinking about the vulnerability aspects and talking about it as a group, I would say that I really, even though maybe we didn't have like a formal conversation after the piece, I think that we were talking about the day whenever you brought the tissue paper in and we were talking about vulnerability as a group. I think that like opening that door in conversation from the creation of the work kind of shifted what was happening within the choreography and like the connection process as a group until the end of it. So even though that was something that maybe happened after, I think that it was something like I was like still listening to and I think it started to go into like towards the end of the inside. That's how it felt at least.
Question about the underground stuff. So I know you were talking a little bit about like when you found the underground work and you're showing on vulnerability aspects. But could you just talk a little bit about like moments in rehearsal or when there were those uncomfortable spaces of actually empathizing and being comfortable with that empathy, and like because she talks about sitting in uncomfortable spaces, right? That's something that she talks about a bunch. Like, did that come up in rehearsal? Was that something that like was directly addressed? Out of curiosity, it's something that I've always been fascinated with, that idea and about how it applies to artistic practices.
Yeah, we had, I can't remember when, I think it was still in the summer that was actually kind of the most uncomfortable. It might be a strong word for this discussion, but this discussion on empathizing with those that we don't feel would naturally deserve the empathy. So having to, go into that realm of this person harmed this other person, but do they deserve empathy? And it was uncomfortable to sit with that and realize, okay, I totally could forgive that person. And then you remember the action that we're talking about. And so it was a little uncomfortable just to situate around that discussion. The artistic process, the physicality of it, the dancers knew each other so well. I was like, okay, we did this like spider hug thing where it's like, I don't know if you guys did this on the swing set a little, but when you like one person sitting, the other person just sits on top and you like swing. And I'd be like, okay, we're going to do this for 5 minutes. And they would just sit on each other and like hug. And they're like, okay, now you're going to look in each other's eyes. And they would just do it. And it was like never, I'm sure it was a little uncomfortable, but never to the point where it was like a desertion from the exercise. Everybody held through. So I'm wondering how that would change with people that didn't know each other, people I didn't know. Yeah.
About putting yourself in the like that, about vulnerability.
Oh, yeah.
Defending it,
I had some discomfort with that. I had made the decision to be in the piece, and then when this whole vulnerability thing came in and that feeling of vulnerable, I immediately went home and I was like, I'm just gonna, I don't think I can be in the piece anymore. It's too hard choreographically. Like, and then I was like, oh, that's not what's happening. You're just being a baby. Yeah. I kind of had to head on address that this is uncomfortable and that's a good thing. That's what the whole reason is for. And so, really, yeah. And then it was like, I would have been so brokenhearted not being in the piece at that point, especially after making so much of it. And now I don't get sick anymore for performances. We had the grad show and I wasn't even sick. That was totally normal. So that only happened because I actually stuck with it. Yeah.
That's a good segue. So I'm curious what you found out more about yourself too, with all your research of your own, I guess, and did it change you or how you respond to people's situations, movies? Same, yeah.
Still can't watch any of the movies. I was a little worried about kind of feeding that what I was considering this unhealthy version of myself, and like if I don't want to empathize more, but it actually, I feel like it almost balanced me out in a way where I can equally empathize with everybody. So even in these situations that are kind of painful, I can see from this person, maybe this is about how much control they have over the situation. So there is like a weird type of balance that I've found that still hasn't actually permeated into me being able to watch movies and TV like normal. But yeah.
So related to that, the exercises that you did were about enhancing empathy. Did you ever look into how to inhibit empathy or exercises around that idea?
I didn't. I guess I didn't look into exercises for inhibiting because I thought it would be more applicable for enhancing, but which is kind of ironic because I wanted that for myself. But we almost happened upon it with, it seems like the inhibition of empathy happens subconsciously because it seems to be the easier route. So it's almost more work, it is more work to do the opposite. But I think just like I learned a lot about how it functions by looking at the non-functioning, I think I would gain a really insightful perspective on these exercises by looking at what they would look like in the opposite direction.
That's it?